Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com. Global warming isn't keeping people warm. Fossil fuels are. This week in 1923, the New York Times reported cold snap breaks gas record. 195 million cubic feet of natural gas used in one day. The extreme cold weather of the last few days is reflected in the amount of gas consumption in the city. Over the past 2 weeks, we've been subjected to lots of propaganda claiming that cold weather is caused by global warming. But we've always had extreme cold, and for at least a century, people have been relying on natural gas to keep from freezing to death. Before that, people relied on firewood to keep warm, which was extremely damaging to the environment and caused huge amounts of air pollution. But now climate alarmists say that emissions from burning fossil fuels are causing the Arctic to melt and we're all going to drown. Climate alarmists say that there's been a huge increase in the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere over the past century, and it's causing catastrophic changes in climate. It isn't difficult to check these claims out. In that same issue of the New York Times on February 25, 1923, they had another article. Report: the Arctic is getting warmer. Old glaciers have disappeared. Changes in flora and fauna. The Arctic seems to be warming up. Reports from fishermen, seal hunters, and explorers who sail the seas about Spitsbergen in the eastern Arctic all point to a radical change in climatic conditions and hitherto unheard of high temperatures in that part of the Earth. Old glaciers have disappeared and land once covered with field ice is bare. Many old landmarks are so changed as to be unrecognizable. Where formerly great masses of ice were found, there are now often moraines, accumulations of earth and stones. At many points where glaciers formerly extended far into the sea, they have entirely disappeared. There were few seals in Spitsbergen waters this year, the catch now being far below average. This, however, did not surprise the captain. He pointed out that formerly the waters about Spitsbergen held an even summer temperature up to 3 degrees Celsius. This year recorded temperatures up to 15 degrees, and last winter the ocean did not freeze over even on the north coast of Spitsbergen. So 100 years ago, with carbon dioxide levels much lower, the Arctic was seeing radical warmth, glaciers were disappearing, the ocean had warmed up 12 degrees, and there wasn't any ice around Spitsbergen even during the winter. And at the same time, conditions in the United States were extremely cold. This is very similar to the climate which alarmists claim is occurring right now. What they were seeing in 1923 obviously had nothing to do with an increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere because such a thing hadn't occurred. Here's a map from the Washington Times around that same period. The black area shows the extent of the ice around Spitsbergen during the prior winter. You can see that Spitsbergen was completely devoid of sea ice during the winter of 1922. Now let's compare ice during the winter of 1922 to the summer of 2020. There was lots of ice around Spitsbergen last summer, but during the winter of 1922, there was no ice at all. So to make it clear, there's more ice now around Spitsbergen than there was 100 years ago. Here's another article from the Chicago Tribune, March 1, 1923. The Arctic Ocean is growing much warmer, at least in certain parts. This has been confirmed by numerous scientific expeditions this winter. Spitsbergen is now free from all ice, and the permanent ice fields of the Greenland Sea have retreated 2,500 miles north of Norway. So we know that the Arctic was very warm 100 years ago, and this was confirmed by numerous scientific expeditions. Here's another article from the St. Louis Star from 1922. Let's take a closer look at this map, which was prepared by the explorer Stephenson. He said that the ice between the North Pole and Alaska was young, thin, moving ice. To judge from Stephenson's description of the polar ice, the submarine could only be used in the region extending from the North Pole towards Alaska and eastern Siberia. This is a region of new ice, consequently thin ice and rotten ice. Climate alarmists love to claim that the ice in the Arctic Ocean used to be very, very thick, like 50, 60 feet thick. It's only been in the last 30 years that it got thin. But this delusion simply isn't true, as the New York Times pointed out on October 19, 1958. They said, Although the idea that a solid ice sheet covers the central Arctic has lingered stubbornly in the popular fancy, the northern cap of ice worn by our planet is actually a thin crust on the whole, only about 7 feet thick. So in 1958, the New York Times said that Arctic sea ice was about 7 feet or 2 meters thick. And now, in the year 2021, the ice in the Arctic Ocean is about 2 meters thick, or the same as it was in the year 1958. And note that there's lots of ice in Baffin Bay. Let's compare that to 1924. In 1924, the U.S. Weather Bureau reported that Baffin Bay was largely free of ice during winter. So we know that 100 years ago, Arctic sea ice wasn't terribly different than it is now. But climate alarmists claim the exact opposite and say that it's due to an increase in the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. As is normally the case, they are making information up. Either they haven't done any research or they're simply lying about the past, thinking that nobody's ever going to catch them on it. Now let's go back even further to 6,000 years ago. According to the Geologic Survey of Norway, the Arctic Ocean may have been periodically ice-free. This provides us with a couple very important pieces of information. One is that the Arctic was much warmer 6,000 years ago, despite the fact that carbon dioxide levels were much lower, and the other is that polar bears survived having no ice at all. This information destroys two of the fundamental tenets of climate alarmism. Other evidence for a much warmer Arctic in the past are tree stumps which grew 5,000 years ago right up to the edge of the Arctic Ocean. This area is now permafrost and the tree line is 80 to 100 kilometers further south. Trees can't grow here now, it's too cold. Trees don't lie, but climate scientists do. Before climate science was hijacked by modelers, there were people doing some good work. Here's a peer-reviewed article from May 3, 2000. Radiocarbon-dated microfossils are used to document Holocene tree line history across northern Russia, including Siberia. Boreal forest developments in this region commenced by 10,000 years before present over most of Russia. Forests advanced to near the current Arctic coastline between 9,000 and 7,000 years before the present, and retreated to its present position by between 4,000 and 3,000 years before present. There is huge amounts of evidence that Earth was warmer during the past 10,000 years than it is now, despite the fact that carbon dioxide levels were much lower. This was shown in the 1990 report of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They published these graphs at a time when they were less politically driven than they are now. The graph showed that Earth was much warmer 5,000 years ago and that we are currently in one of the coldest periods of the last 9,000 years. They also showed that Earth was much warmer 800 years ago during the medieval warm period. Throughout these entire periods, there was very little change in the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's pretty clear from these graphs that Earth's temperature moves independently of the amounts of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Recent claims made by NASA that carbon dioxide controls Earth's temperature are not supported by evidence. One of the more ridiculous claims being made by climate alarmists is that the cold weather in Texas is caused by global warming. Climate alarmists claim that the Arctic is very warm and the ice is melting. But for some reason, when Arctic air comes down to Texas, it gets extremely cold. And alarmists claim that the cold air in Texas is due to disruption of the polar vortex by global warming. This doesn't make any sense, but to check out what they're saying, let's look at the history of cold weather in Texas. This graph shows all 139,192 Texas February temperature readings in the NOAA United States Historical Climatology Network database. This year has been very cold, but there were lots of other years in the past which were just as cold or colder. 2011 had cold weather, 1989 was extremely cold, and 1933 had the coldest weather on record in Texas. The cold weather in Texas this year is not unprecedented, and in fact it's not even particularly unusual. Texas had terribly cold weather in 1989, but people weren't freezing to death. So what's changed? What has changed is that climate alarmists have been beating the drum of global warming, warning that Texas was going to overheat. This article from Texas leading climate academics was published 10 years ago in the Houston Chronicle. They said Texas is vulnerable to warming climate. Get used to it. The weather of the 21st century will be very much like the hot and dry weather of 2011. This claim by the climate scientists was impressively ignorant because, as we just saw, 2011 also had some very cold weather in Texas. But they've been telling the same story to people in Texas government over and over again, and their propaganda has worked. And so when the cold weather came to Texas this year, Texas was unprepared for it. 2 weeks before the cold hit, climate forecasters were predicting a very warm February in Texas. February temperatures over 90 or 100 degrees are not uncommon in Texas. So when forecasters predict warmer than normal temperatures, they're talking about really warm. Climate scientists have been telling Texas government for decades that they can stop global warming by building lots of windmills. And 3 days before the cold weather hit this year, USA Today was bragging about how dependent Texas had become on wind energy. They said that up to 60% of Texas power was coming from wind energy, and that it proved that Joe Biden's climate plans were going to work. Joe Biden wants to shut down fossil fuels and run the world off wind and solar. But then the cold weather hit, the wind turbines froze up, and people started freezing to death in Texas in large numbers. Freezing rain and historically low temperatures iced many of the wind turbines to a halt. But the problem was worse than that, as Congressman Dan Crenshaw explained. He said, a mix of over-subsidized wind energy and underinvestment in gas power means that we didn't have enough baseload energy for a massive spike in demand. Because of global warming propaganda and government subsidies for wind energy, Texas government has been focused on the wrong thing. They've been building lots of unreliable wind turbines and haven't been taking care of their reliable sources of energy. So when the cold weather hit, so did disaster. The wind turbines shut down, and Texas wasn't able to compensate with fossil fuels because their government had taken their eye off the ball. This was terrible news for propagandists who had been bragging about wind energy in Texas just a few days earlier. So the propagandists did exactly what you would expect them to do. They started lying about what happened in Texas. Bill Gates bought his way onto the airwaves and started spreading mindless nonsense. February 21st, Bill Gates, failure to achieve zero net emissions by 2050 will cause migration worse than Syrian crisis. Gates also pushed back against the claim from Texas Governor Greg Abbott, who said that the woes facing the state's power grid during their winter storm is the result of failures of green energy, particularly wind. That's not at all true, Gates said, saying that the power shortage was the result of failure to weatherize power systems. He said that while wind turbines are part of this, it's possible to weatherize them, as evidenced by their use in North Dakota and Alaska. Bill Gates has one of the largest carbon footprints in the world, and his lifestyle is completely dependent on fossil fuels. But he says that we don't need fossil fuels and that wind turbines in North Dakota prove his point. However, the people who actually live in North Dakota say the opposite. When the wind turbines froze up, Senator Kevin Cramer of North Dakota tweeted, "Gee, who would have imagined something like this could happen?" And Representative Kelly Armstrong from North Dakota pushed back against the transition to green energy. If we continue down policies that make them baseload power, we're going to see more and more of these events happen, he said. This was the photograph of the frozen wind turbine which was being circulated. The wind turbine was actually located in Sweden. Bill Gates says that wind turbines don't freeze up in cold climates, but most people, probably even Greta Thunberg, would agree that Sweden is a cold climate. And Goran Peterson from Sweden sent me this tweet. The wind turbines didn't work well during the cold period in February in Sweden. Nearly all electricity was generated by hydropower and nuclear energy. We had to import coal power from Poland and Denmark. This article appeared in Wind Power Engineering Development magazine on October 25, 2018. The cold, hard truth about ice on turbine blades. Bill Gates has been all over the airwaves spreading misinformation about wind turbines in cold climates. He claims that he knows things which simply aren't true. I live in a cold climate in Cheyenne, Wyoming, on the edge of a gigantic wind farm. Last week we had our coldest late winter weather on record, and the wind turbines froze up. Northern Colorado gets most of their electricity from a coal-fired power plant about 20 miles south of the Wyoming border. But the governor of Colorado has announced that the state's electricity is going to be 100% green by the year 2030. So they're planning on shutting down their coal-fired power plants, and they're building lots of wind turbines in places like Wyoming. This article is from the Loveland, Colorado newspaper on February 16, 2021. Let's see what the Loveland newspaper reported on February 16th. The intense cold at Platte River Power Authority's wind farms in Wyoming forced operators to shut them down. When ice builds on the windmill blades, it creates an imbalance that can damage the turbines, Rolstead said. As it turned out, the wind wasn't blowing there anyway, so wind farm shutdowns had little impact. Solar resources were also of little to no help because the solar panels were covered with snow. The cold and limited sunshine kept the snow from melting. So northern Colorado was faced with a situation where it was extremely cold, the wind wasn't blowing, the wind turbines were covered with ice, and the solar panels were covered with snow. People in northern Colorado were completely dependent on fossil fuels for their survival, yet the government plans to shut the fossil fuels down in the next 9 years. I knew this was going on, so I drove down there early in the morning on February 15th. The temperature was about 10 below zero Fahrenheit. Here's the Rawhide coal plant. You can see that it's putting out just a little bit of steam and no other visible emissions. You can also see that the steam is moving vertically up into the air because there's no wind. This huge array of solar panels was just built in the last couple of years and destroyed huge amounts of wildlife habitat which the pronghorns used to enjoy. But the solar panels were completely covered with snow and they were useless. Without the fossil fuel power, a lot more people would have frozen to death in Colorado than did in Texas. But the Colorado governor is still planning on shutting down their fossil fuels. The bottom paragraph in this Loveland newspaper article gives us a clue as to what's going on. It says the solution to situations such as this past weekend and what could occur in future years as utilities shut down coal-fired power plants will be tapping into larger networks. What they're saying is that when they shut down their coal plants, they're going to need to get their electricity from other states like Wyoming. Colorado is banking on the idea that other states won't be as irresponsible as Colorado's been. The Colorado governor is shutting down their essential fossil fuel supply in order to virtue signal about climate. And Colorado is going to be dependent on governors from other states being more responsible than their own governor is. This is a pretty risky and dangerous strategy. Climate alarmists are claiming that the cold is caused by global warming and that you can stop global warming by building more unreliable windmills which freeze up when it gets cold. This is complete insanity and is some of the most irrational thinking which mankind has ever faced about an important issue. Wind and solar are not reliable in the cold. In fact, we can count on them to fail. We've known this for a long time. During the very cold winter of 2010 in Britain, the wind farms in Scotland shut down for the same reasons. When Arctic air comes down to the mid-latitudes, it's associated with high pressure, and there's very little wind. You can't count on wind energy during Arctic cold snaps. All of Bill Gates' money, his propaganda, and his infomercials can't change reality. And the same problem happens during the hottest days of summer, as Britain found out in 2018. Britain went for almost 2 weeks without wind power during a heat wave because the wind wasn't blowing. And besides the fact that wind power isn't reliable, it also isn't green. It's incredibly destructive to the environment. If you killed an eagle, you'd go to jail for a long time. But Barack Obama gave wind turbine operators license to kill thousands of them. Now let's go back to Bill Gates' claim that the Syrian crisis was caused by carbon dioxide. Bill Gates apparently believes that droughts in Syria are caused by people in other parts of the world burning fossil fuels. But Syria has always had droughts, and in 1933 experts blamed the droughts on yo-yos. January 23, 1933, yo-yo banned in Syria, blamed for drought by Muslims. Drought and severe cold is disastrously affecting the cattle in Syria, and the Muslim chiefs at Damascus have attributed the wrath of the heavens to the recent introduction of the yo-yo. The chiefs interviewed the prime minister and exposed the evil influence of yo-yos, so they were immediately banned. Today the police paraded through the streets and confiscated the yo-yos from everyone they saw playing with them. This sounds pretty ridiculous, but it isn't any more ignorant than what Bill Gates is saying. Bill Gates is not a scientist and he's not an engineer. He's a guy with a lot of money who has the power to buy influence and airtime. And he's pretty much like a yo-yo himself. I've been saying for years that one of the primary goals of the global warming scam is to shut down U.S. energy supplies. I tweeted this shortly after the election. Shutting down U.S. energy supplies means dependence on Middle East oil, which means a permanent state of war for the military-industrial complex. President Trump was the only president for decades who didn't start a new war, but it only took Joe Biden about 4 weeks to get us back in the war business. When you bomb children in Syria like Joe Biden and Barack Obama did last time they were in the White House, it's going to cause a lot of people to want to leave. Bombing a country is a proven way to create a refugee crisis. The path the United States is headed down is completely insane, but some other countries are starting to regain their sanity. Germany's green energy failure. Germany turns back to dirty coal and natural gas as millions of its solar panels are blanketed in snow and ice. And The Guardian reported last week, Mexico was once a climate leader. Now it's betting big on coal. Democrats love to brag about green energy in China, but they're building coal-fired power plants 3 times faster than the rest of the world combined. The United States is committing suicide, and even John Kerry seems to understand that at some level. President Biden's climate czar John Kerry admitted Wednesday that the U.S. reducing its emissions to zero wouldn't make much of a difference in the global climate change fight. He said, when almost 90% of all of the planet's global emissions come from outside of U.S. borders, we could go to zero tomorrow and the problem isn't solved. I've been pointing this out for years. U.S. CO2 emissions have been declining for a long time. All we're doing by destroying our energy infrastructure is virtue signaling. We're not preventing hurricanes or saving Pacific Islanders from drowning. All that this climate change green energy propaganda is doing right now is freezing people to death in Texas. And it's going to get a lot worse if we continue down the same irrational path we're headed down now. We have hundreds of millions of people in the United States who are used to having energy available when they need it. And a lot of them have no clue where the energy comes from. They simply take it for granted because they've always had it. And they don't understand how important the energy is until the supply gets cut off, like what happened in Texas this week. What's happening in Texas is awful, and it's unfortunate that people like Bill Gates are willing to go on television and lie about it to the American public. Voltaire said, "Those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities." What isn't clear to me is whether Bill Gates is a victim of the climate propaganda or if he's one of the perpetrators. He may actually believe the nonsense which comes out of his mouth. People have always imagined that the climate is changing. This article was printed 150 years ago. Brisbane Courier, January 10, 1871. Imaginary changes of climate. 3 consecutive years of drought, while they have stimulated the inventive resources of practical agriculturalists, have had the natural effect of calling forth a plentiful crop of speculation from weather prophets and projectors and half-instructed meteorologists, and all the philosophic tribe of Laputa in general, to whom the periodical press now affords such fatal facilities. We've often noticed that in the tabular statements of those compilers of weather records who write to the Times, useful and welcome as their communications are, every season is sure to be extraordinary, almost every month one of the driest or wettest or windiest, coldest or hottest ever known. Much observation which ought to correct a tendency to exaggerate seems in some minds to have rather a tendency to increase it. And not only do people imagine that the climate is changing, but they've always wanted to blame it on somebody else. During the 16th century, Europeans blamed bad weather on witches and burned tens of thousands of them at the stake for cooking the weather. And similar to the Europeans, the Aztecs believed that they could prevent drought by sacrificing the lives of tens of thousands of people. And now we have the same thing going on in the United States. People are literally freezing to death to appease the climate change gods. Toto has been pulling back the curtain on this insanity for the past 13 years. You can visit him and Kyrie on the web at realclimatescience.com.